I mean, I love studying that part of history, and I love the dialogues between them. And actually, if you go in, a lot of my coaching is actually influenced by those kind of dialogues to go deeper, question things at a deeper level. And even if you go further back, like in like ancient cultures in India, it was like a normal part of development for anybody to have, and then to have in their community. And we were talking about this a little bit before the podcast that this, if you really look at it, this was part of human community that was conducted. It was held by people who were the holders of wisdom. A lot of times they were the elders, the medicine doctors, those kind of people within the tribe, or somebody else within the tribe who thought differently, who approached things in a different way, differently from others, but they revered. But just like a lot of other things that kind of got dropped off when you go to back to the industrial age, everything got compartmentalized. Family structures, like family units separated. We went towards separate family units versus living in the same space or in the same general space. With that, a lot of things get dropped off. Used to be that elders used to live in the same community and they had a specific function around supporting the community. They wouldn't retire. That was a very interesting, the idea of retirement that came up around this time too. Retirement was never a thing for human beings. It was just they took on a different role. They were less with their physical body, but they did something else. And even so, there was a lecture I was listening to in India when somebody would get to a retirement. They didn't call it retirement. Get to an age where their normal responsibilities were done with their kids and everybody else. They would actually go on a spiritual journey, and for that spiritual journey to start, they would get a guide, somebody who would take them there. In fact, they would have to actually shed their clothes, their identity, name all of it, to go on that spiritual journey, so they can come back with a bigger identity to their community and tribe. They would bring back the wisdom, which was very interesting. And they even have two terms for it. I don't know if I can remember it. The first stage, that initial stage up until like 60 years old, something like that, was griharsta, something they had a Sanskrit word for it. And then the second stage, which they would just go, I know the translation, but I don't know the actual word, was forest dweller. They would have to actually, it was actually, the tradition was that they would literally shed their clothes. Some would even go naked to the forest, but a lot of the times it became with the white cloth. They would meet with their guide, somebody who had gone through that journey, and they would go on a spiritual journey. But the purpose of that is so you can gain more wisdom and come back to your tribe. It was not to retire. And I think a lot of these functions disappeared over time in human community. But now there's a resurge of these things coming up in different ways, whether it comes through coaches, therapists, all sorts of other different modalities of healing. It's coming back around because there's a need and demand for it. And I want to talk a little bit about, as we move forward, as what's happening when there are more and more coaches coming into the picture. What does that mean for coaches who are starting a business in the new age, in the AI and business age? But I'd love to hear a little bit from Daniel around this as well, because he's around a little bit. He's actually been longer in the coaching world than I have.
Well, I love how things you just brought up, Faisal, and also Kimberly. Thank you for sharing a lot of that history of coaching. The one thing that I remember learning about, I was at a coaching seminar. Of course, I've been to many, as I'm sure we have. And I looked this up just before our session today on the podcast. And the term coach actually appeared also in an Oxford dictionary around tutors like they were carrying you through to the exam or whatever. It was like in the early 1800s. And I thought that was a really interesting point. Like the coach is what carries you. This kind of, we're talking about the carriage. The coach is almost like there's a carriage that you create this container for somebody else, and you have to go from where they are today to somewhere else, or between states, right? And I love that word states that you use. It's like we're going between states. Like that could be a pun, right? It's like it's a state as like a location, or a state as like a state of being, a state of what you're experiencing. There's so many pieces of that, and I think we're all beneficiaries of going back thousands of years to this process of guiding and coaching. And the Socratic method is a really, as Faisal said, like, and you said too, Kimberly, is like, if you can be there to listen to them doing this at the beginnings of this process as they're really developing the system. And, sometimes as coaches, the thing that occurred to me is sometimes as coaches, we get we get scared of judgment. And so, especially for newer coaches, it's like, oh, do I really come out and say these things that I feel need to be said? And so, like, if I think about Socrates, and like he was, put to death because he was corrupting the youth by asking Socratic questions. He's really just asking questions. And so, even today, you can see that kind of cultural challenge. People asking questions or people saying truths that people don't want to hear. It's you know it's not as hard as being put to death today in our country, in America, or Canada, but there are countries where things that you say can still put you to death. And so I think I just been really appreciating the freedom that we have to practice coaching, to practice like the Socratic method, and to really question things that not everybody has. So I was just feeling really grateful. Given the history, it's not over. Like the history is still going, and people are still coming to terms with new technologies and new social structures around things that make it possible or not possible to coach in different contexts. So a little bit of gratitude that we've come a long way, that we have this opportunity right now.
You're right, Daniel. The questioning. Tony Robbins talked about give yourself 5 questions, ask yourself 5 questions, or the state of your life is determined by the questions you're asking. So if you're asking questions and making yourself think, and it's different than the community you live in, they're going to be fearful. A lot of people are afraid of people who think or who question, and we want to kill fear. So you're right. It's like great leaders and great thinkers have been put to death. So I would hope that that doesn't make a coach feel afraid to step out there and help people understand and question better. Anyway, I
And
don't fear.
there's another point here too, and I love the way this conversation is going because people are not put to death on this side of the world, but there is a huge movement around suppression of expression, and in a sense as well. Even though like the freedom of expression is a huge thing in the Western world, but now the complexity is increasing so much as people are coming together. Our lines of communication is becoming more open. People don't know how to talk anymore. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten on a call with a client. Like these are like very successful professionals,
Yeah.
entrepreneurs, and their 40s, 50s, 60s. And especially when I talk, one of the things I always like asking is like, are there any areas that you might not be showing up as your best? One does, and usually you start to see the reaction, and I get one of two reactions. If somebody is really courageous, bold leader, like, in fact, I feel like I show up a little bit too much, to be honest. Oh, they were like they never hesitate. But then you get a different quality of answer around that. Like they will sit and think. In most places, yes, but then in this other place, I can't. In one of two places that happens. One, in their professional life, they struggle to speak their mind. Two, even in their own like relationship, in their own marriage, they don't know how to express themselves. They don't know how to speak their truth. And what ends up happening is that often you see is that there's a blocking, and there's a courage problem. And but there's a reason for it. There's a reaction. They're afraid of a reaction on the outside. And I wouldn't say it's all on them that they decided to do this, or but there is a general thing that's happening out the world where people don't know how to express. People don't know how to show up with courage. People don't know how to. I did. I struggled with that for a long time. To this day, I struggle at times when should I be speaking this? Should I not be speaking this? But I do my best to navigate that situation. But I lean towards let's speak your mind, speak your heart, wherever it is. But I think we're also talking about how do we develop better leaders who actually create environments where people feel safe to share. People don't feel judged. People don't feel scrutinized. And by the way, it's not a lot of people are afraid of being judged sometimes more than death itself. It's like, what was that thing people are more afraid of?
Public
Uh,
speaking.
uh, the
People are
science.
so afraid of public speaking to the point where they're more afraid of it than death. So they'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's something like that. So there is big challenge in there around that. And I think a big part of what I try to do with my clients is to help them understand how they can create a community around them or people around them where they are free to speak their mind. They are free to engage with integrity. They do create communities where people feel safe to share. People are open to feedback, and that's actually a part of our culture in CMC is that whatever feedback we have, no matter how painful it is, we want to give it. We don't want to hold it back. Of course, we do it with kindness, compassion, but that's what helps us grow as human beings, as coaches. That's like we need to understand what's the positive and negative that we're doing, that we're showing up with, and just so if somebody's wondering, we all come up with that, show up with this with both sides.